Hi, good evening, everybody. Um, I hope you can all hear me okay. So I'd like to welcome you to the second in our Farming for the Future series. My name is Caroline Aitken and I'm the Programme Development Lead for our new BSc in Regenerative Food and Farming, which is the first undergraduate course of its kind in the country. Makes use of our unique context here on the Dartington estate and all of the diverse food and farming enterprises that we have here, as well as drawing on an amazing range of partnerships across the country and across the world. And I'm delighted this evening to be partnering with Chelsea Green Publishing. So we'll be talking to some of their food and farming authors about their work and their books and current issues in food and farming and all things land-based and ecological. So these talks are taking place on the last Tuesday of each month, and we've got a couple more scheduled in, so keep your eyes peeled for those. So we would like to invite you to ask questions towards the end of this session. So if you have questions as we go through, please, if you could put them in the Q&A section. So on your bottom menu, you'll see that there's a chat panel, but there's also a Q&A panel. So if you could put your questions in there, and we'll see how many of them we can get to later on in the session. So I'd like to introduce you this evening. Our author this evening is Matt Rees-Warren, who is author of The Ecological Gardener. And Matt is a gardener, a designer and writer, and has worked for the National Trust and been head gardener of Kilvercourt Gardens near Shepton Mallet, amongst other places. And The Ecological Gardener is a book which is looking at not so much food growing and food production, but more ornamental gardening and the way that we manage our gardens. And this is a topic which is often omitted from the sort of the ecological library, really, how we apply these principles to ornamental gardening. So we'll be interested to hear from Matt about his approach and his book and everything else. So before we talk more about the book, Matt is going to introduce you to some of his ideas. And so good evening, Matt.
Hi, Caroline. Thank you. Brilliant. Okay. Okay. Well, first I would like to thank the Dartington Trust for inviting me to talk at this event. Very privileged. And also to my publisher, Chelsea Green, for producing my, my book, wonderful journey with them, that this talk is based upon, The Ecological Gardener, which is released this Thursday. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit first just on the outline or the reason and the genesis for wanting to write the book and its ethoses and messages, and then condense this down into a more succinct look at design elements, as Caroline said, more within the sort of ornamental section of gardening and gardens with an ecological framework. Okay, so let's jump in. So the idea for the book was, I pitched it a couple of years ago. So many of you will understand that in 2019, the awareness of the ecological decline and climate crisis was heightened. It stepped up. It felt like it was a big change from what we had usually had. There was seismic reports from people like the IPCC on climate change, the IPBES on biodiversity loss. There was action on the streets, XR, for example, and then even sort of high-profile people such as David Attenborough talking on mainstream TV about these issues. We have always known about a lot of especially biodiversity, as you can see in the slides. So things like 97% of UK wildflower meadows have disappeared. We've known that for a long time now. Wetland habitat is disappeared at an alarming rate. We have one of the lowest covers of woodland in all of the UK, and this all brings together to a decrease in biodiversity of the wildlife since 1970 on a rather sort of steady decline. So what all that meant was it made me take another look, a fresh look at my world, as in gardens, gardening and horticulture, and say, okay, so we've been going along sort of, and maybe the sort of, you know, the nicety of it and the ease of it, and organic and beefery, but something had changed dramatically. So you had to look at it dramatically differently. So, you know, like a green space, a lawn is better than a, you know, tarmac drive just isn't good enough anymore. It's got to be more heightened than that, higher. And that was where the main sense of, okay, so yeah, it's something that's really firing in the mind, and wanted to write about it. This one there, but what it felt like was a great opportunity. So gardens are not wild spaces. We have to look after our wild spaces, but they are natural spaces. And if you put them all together, they are a great mass, a huge landmass, equivalent to many different sort of parks and areas within the UK. So it's a fantastic opportunity to enact tangible change. So, you know, a garden can be a sanctuary for wildlife. You know, if in many other industries, aviation, fashion, to just give two examples, you'd always be mitigating the effects of what you're doing. But within a garden, you can really go out there and do it with your own hands and make a difference that's tangible. But what I knew from being a professional gardener and working in gardens for a long time was that it would take a new approach, a new mindset, and a changed ethos to the craft of gardening, because traditional practices had been prevalent in gardening for so long that actually maybe people believed, oh, it's, you know, it's a lovely garden, it's got trees, that was enough. But I knew that some of these practices, such as using cement or concrete in construction of gardens, using tap water, or, you know, pesticides on lawns, I knew that these things had become so prevalent that they needed a fresh look and a new outlook on them. And so I think that was where the whole idea for the book was born. So let's think a little bit more on what that means for designing your garden, in a sense, if it's brand new, so a blank canvas, you may be taking that on, or it might be a mature garden that you've taken over, or it might just be that your garden out there is sit there and it is what it is, and you need a fresh approach and a new look at it. So the main thing to think about first and foremost when you're approaching a garden is to think nature first is the new step you need to think. And you might think that you do that, but it's more than likely that most people, or I've seen within my industry, don't do that. It's sort of aesthetics first, or you know, your own personal pleasure, what we want it to look like, or what we want to do in it, sit and eat, and those things aren't bad, but maybe just not first. So nature must come first. And if you begin to think like that, you begin to think of a garden less as just a space to exist in, and more as an ecosystem, which they are. They might be really deficient and depleted ecosystems, but they are outside, they are in the natural world, and they are. But trying to bring them into a heightened and more dynamic and biodiverse ecosystem is our aim when we're looking at it and looking to design it. We're never going to be able to many people, when they hear ecosystem, they think of jungles, you know, these extremely diverse spaces. It's never going to be that, and it's never going to be a fully wild space, because we are always going to be involved in it. It is the human hand and the natural world in a garden. It's a hyper reality, as you were, like a little bit like making compost is a you know, hyper process of regeneration that happens in the wild that we like to do. So that would be the first mindset, to detail into that, taking that mind frame and going out into your space and thinking about design would be to start to abandon traditional ideas of neatness and order. It's prevalent to think about gardens as outdoor rooms, treat them as living rooms to be ordered and tidied, or I've seen within the profession of gardening, a neatness and order is seen as a sense of achievement within gardening. So, you know, the lawns are clipped perfectly, edges are cut, hedges are cut and clipped, you know, in the middle of the summer. All of these things make gardens look like someone has been working in it and they've achieved something. But if you want to create an ecosystem, you step away from that. You need to allow a garden to be a moving mosaic, you know, dynamic, untidy. This can include sort of wildflowers. And what I mean by that is wandering wildflowers. So when things come in and make their home within the cracks of the paving, or maybe, you know, you planted out a border all perfectly and nicely, and they always do look like that when you start out, and then wandering wildflowers are going to come in and take over. You always need to weed them out, maybe some, but maybe not all, to allow a garden to move and change. And the same can be said for long grass. I think I've started to realize saying to people, you just need a meadow instead of a lawn sort of is off-putting. It's not necessarily about that. It's different lengths of grass, thinking about when you design a garden, and you will have areas in which you can sit on grass and areas that are a little bit longer and areas that even are longer still and are left all summer long and never touched. That kind of diversity creates dynamic movement within a garden for everything, wildlife and to everything that you would need to make it into an ecosystem. And then finally, like wild hedges. So as I touched on, there's a classic a formal English or French or Italian garden is a well-clipped hedges, parterres, box, they're all cut in the summer, sometimes twice, sometimes even 3 times. So you are eradicating any possibility of flowering and fruiting and nesting even, or, you know, so you to allow them to be a bit looser is to allow nature in. Okay. Yeah, so another really important thing to look at before you enact anything within a garden, especially if you're starting from a blank canvas, is to decide and understand how the working functions of the garden are going to enact and work within your garden before you consider the pleasure and the aesthetics. They come second. So a good example of this is compost piles. So even in the smallest space you have, if you're not thinking about having a compost pile in your garden, you are really abandoning any idea that you'll be able to have a really sustainable regenerative system of using waste, and being able to sort of you know, close yourself off from outside resources of needing to bring more soil in. So, you know, again, traditional sort of ideas, open expanses to sit and play on, or patios, lawns, all of this is the main elements that then paths and stuff have worked around. Whereas if you begin to work your paths around the core functions, like compost piles, then you begin to create a different design in your garden. It can be ponds as well. So certainly not talking about fish ponds. So ponds either for wildlife and irrigation, they can basically be the same thing sometimes. But if you are specifically keeping bodies of water, rainwater certainly, within a garden, you are accepting that you're going to need water to sustain a garden. Certainly you will, even with ornamental gardens, if you're planting new plants, new trees, new shrubs, new perennials, you're going to need to water them quite a lot more than you would years later as they mature in that first year. So yes, you need more water if you're doing a productive garden, but you're also definitely going to need water within a ornamental garden. So understanding that you're going to need to harvest certain quantities of water can be a forefront of your thought as a design They can, for a lesser extent, be about greenhouses. They're usually in very large properties and quite geared towards production, but greenhouse are only really about using the sun energy. So it's using and utilizing the free resource. So it can be as small as just, you know, a cold frame, or small, just you're thinking when you're designing about utilizing the sun's energy to the best you can, so that you don't need to bring anything else in. It can also be for wildlife, so these functional areas, working functional areas just for wildlife. You can think of meadows and hedgerows and wildlife ponds and log piles in the same sense, but designing with those functions, and then thinking beyond that, your paths and things that will link it, is a great framework to begin with when you're designing, especially in a new space. So another element that I don't think is overlooked, certainly not, but again, going back to the step change that I feel happened within our understanding of the situation that we face ourselves, the observation of your space and understanding the greater, wider geographical and environmental space that your garden sits within becomes really essential to beginning to form a design in your mind. Specifically for the idea that gardens connected is so much more than gardens as an island. So ideally, if you are very lucky and you have a garden that backs onto a wild space like a forest or something, or a little woodland, or a wild hedgerow or something, then you need to think, okay, how do I join to this? How do I bring that wildlife through and into my garden? How do I let it go in between the two? You know, this can be fundamental to think about. You may not have the luck of that. You know, many of us, including myself, backs onto another garden, you know, within sort of a kind of more suburban area. But that can be more about thinking about wildlife corridors, hedges linked to hedges, and allowing sort of, and thinking like wildlife to, you know, plan out your design and try to allow like nature to move within it. More of, you know, gardens, this whole sort of mosaic, because in the end they will go out to the wild. The town will end, the village will end, the city even will end, and it will go out to wild spaces. And trying to bring your garden closer to that is really essential. It can also be about working with, and certainly not against, elemental forces. So traditionally, sometimes that can be about, you know, draining land or protecting against winds. You know, it's a very, you know, guarded to nature sort of view of gardens, but really, you want to be using wind in the correct way. It can be a great purifier of fungicides and things like that, of fungi and things like that. It can be used, you know, understanding your water table can be really essential. If you understand how high it will go in the winter months, you can start to use it to the best of your ability within your design. And patterns of sunlight, and certainly understanding how hot and how much sun you're going to get, how long the season is going to be, can be really essential to know within your design, and how you're going to form it out to make the most use of that, and even down to microclimates that you're going to be able to use. And finally, understanding like underlying the ground, so the soil, so the subsoil. Do you have clay? Do you have you know, limestone? You sand over chalk? Understanding that and having a fairly good idea of that will be able to bring about a difference in the way in which you approach the land, and the way in which you design and imprint yourself upon the land. Okay, and finally, I certainly think that we need to traverse and adapt our thoughts and designs towards our gardens, you know, onto and into a closed loop system. And that quite simply just means you're aiming at not bringing in any resources and trying to not take anything out that would need to be an apparatus, a huge apparatus such as a waste system needs to look after. And so your garden has extraordinary amount of free resources that you can create, as in the waste that you create from your kitchen becoming your compost, or the rain that falls from the sky that you will collect as rainwater, or even down to the most, I think, most purest regenerative form of a coppice. You can be growing even just one hazel, thinking about putting that within your design can make a huge difference. And then more of a methodology, but it helps to sort of think, and possibly more when you're doing a big project and designing, is thinking about the materials and what they will mean. So whether you're using plastics, avoid at all costs within all of your designs, absolutely, and then trying to use recycled and reclaimed materials. If you are bringing from outside, then you're closing loops from somewhere else. And I think all of that together would give you the framework to imprint your own style and your own expression within the garden, whilst keeping it as an ecological space. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. That's a really nice way to sort of summarize some of the real core principles of the book. And I'd really like to revisit some of those as we go through.
Yeah.
But I wondered if you'd mind just telling us, because I know that you've worked in many gardens in the UK and abroad.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about some of your what you feel were your most formative experiences as a gardener, where you might have had those sort of deepening experiences and light bulb moments?
Yeah. Yeah, because if you've been gardening that long, so I've been going about sort of 15 years now, there really are certain moments that that do stick with you, actually. And I think sometimes they're not the best, so that you learn from that. So it's difficult to name places, but I remember, working for one client many years ago. And it's difficult for me to always imprint my ideas on it. I think I've always deep down been a bit of a ecological gardener and followed sort of organic processes, but I was sort of asked to use pesticides, say, to sort of spray on gravel and things like this, and they wanted to burn everything, and everything was just lifeless, all the lawns cut to the lowest they could be, and hedges just sort of sheared in these perfected sort of symmetry. Even I was even asked to bring out lines, you pull lines along to make sure that they're perfectly straight. And yeah, it really brought home to me how much I want to sort of work towards, away from these influences, and to try and always bring my greatest passion towards people to say, come on, is their space, because I'm talking about sort of private gardens here. It's their space, and I have to sort of, follow their lead, because they are paying me after all. But it was an eye-opener, a huge eye-opener, and it made me realize and see. And so that's why I'm really mentioning it and was glad for it, because I saw the effect. It was a dead space. It had no life to it. I saw none, and so I began to sort of move and change and immerse myself in such different areas that I was able to see, because that was quite formative years, almost probably at the beginning. I was able to see how this is a traditional idea of gardens that you can get sucked into. People can sort of believe that this is the way to do it from lots of more kind of traditional thinking and practices. And so that would have been formative years of seeing the bad to realize the way to go, I think. But in the later years, I really sort of enjoyed working at Curva. The owner Roger Saul is a really keen gardener, organic gardener himself, and so I loved being influenced by the way in which he approached materials. Everything with Roger was, such great style, but yet nothing was new. Everything was reused and let to sort of, become higgledy-piggledy, and the garden was very loose, and everything was allowed to sort of crumble. And I think that was a great influence on me, being able to look at the ornamental sides of garden and be stylish, be sort of like expressionist, be allowed to sort of put yourself in the garden, but also this sort of, able to let things be really kind of recycled and reused and loose and reclaimed. I really love that. Yeah.
So it's a real art, isn't it? I mean, I think gardening is quite an art anyway. And
Yeah.
then sort of to find that balance between a space sort of feeling comfortable to be in, and being an aesthetic sort of success, if you like, but also allowing nature to be. It is a real art, I think, and when people get it right, it's something that all of us really enjoy. And when you talk about the sort of the dead straight hedges and the very shortly cut lawns, that's quite a strong cultural influence, really, isn't it? I think
Yeah.
that often people are feeling maybe a sort of a cultural pressure for their gardens to look tidy. And certainly as a permaculturist, permaculturists have often been described as scruffy gardeners for that reason. But that sort of leads me on to actually asking you, as a permaculturist, I saw a lot of that influence, the influence of permaculture in your book. And so
Yeah.
was that something you were conscious of, and were there other influences?
Absolutely. So, I thought that, permaculture's ideas are fundamentally ecological, aren't they? I mean, they are based on, that as their MO. It's exactly where it comes from. So, yeah, I certainly felt like that was a huge influence in the idea that permaculture, for one, is still sort of bringing its influence into the more productive areas, but it's almost sort of unknown to a degree within the more ornamental. Let's say the sort of National Trust, Gardens Illustrated, High Class, Chelsea, all that stuff. Like they probably would, but its influence, in my opinion, would need to grow and expand, because I certainly have the greatest respect for permaculture's message, 100%. Yeah, from yourself, Carolyn, out towards your Jeff Lawtons and all the way back to your Bill Mollisons. I mean, I liked the way in which it comes from a very simple place. It comes from a understanding of us as people and what we did originally, and how we were sort of light touch on the land from a very, very, very long time ago. So I think I've always really drawn towards messages that are as simple as they can be. Like you can explain it to a child and it makes sense. And I think that's where that influence and that sort of ecological sort of core from permaculture certainly did influence me. Yeah.
And it's and sometimes I wonder whether what's possibly lacking in our society, at least, is maybe sort of people having more of an understanding of ecology and ecological processes. But then, interestingly, as you're talking, I'm aware that well, actually, from reading the book, something that I took away that I enjoyed about the way that you wrote about your experiences was that you felt that most of your learning came from just simply being immersed in the natural world, spending time in gardens and observing. And actually, sometimes that's enough, isn't it? To just observe and respond, to see the nature and respond to it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I am hugely fortunate that because it's my profession, it's 8 hours a day. It's like being a professional chef or something, that's an enormous amount of time. So I do, see the patterns of the seasons go by and down to the patterns of the day. down to, you know, the robin coming down 2 foot from me to the worm in the ground. It is sort of an extremely fortunate position, but certainly no doubt that slowing down and just observing is a fundamental towards not just design but gardening in general. Like anyone who takes on a new space, if I get a client, I might get a consultation. Generally, they've moved into the garden afresh. I almost invariably always say, you know, a really good idea would be to wait a year and just watch the whole season go by and see how it works. But yeah, I mean, on any level, you're going to be influenced by wanting to save something. Let's say, sort of knowing that birds are in decline or biodiversity. Then if you're going out and watching birds, seeing birds in natural habitats, or you're going to jungles, or you're going to different areas in which you know, get to experience it, then yeah, 100%, like you're going to feel something. Gardens are different though. It's, like I say, it's not a wild space, and so it can be a kind of hyper reality. So you could go to a very well kept you know, public institution garden, and you might sort of come away, like you say, influenced by the traditions of it. So sometimes it really is more about taking the walk into the fields and the wild, into the forests, and looking closely, seeing the species, seeing what happens in the hedgerows, and then coming back into your garden and saying, oh, okay, so, you know, I don't necessarily have to go and buy all these sort of like, you know, Chelsea sort of plants and stuff. There's some fantastic plants out there. Maybe I'll be influenced by that instead. So yeah, I mean, the more time that we're out, and especially now away from screens and things, then the more time that we will want to put into gardening. Yeah, I believe that 100%.
It's interesting because I say a similar thing to my clients about, you know, if you possibly can, see the space through the full 12 months, through the seasons, before you make any changes. And while in some ways the advice to just sit in your garden and observe things can be very welcome, I think it can be hard for people to resist sort of wanting to get stuck in and start making big changes.
Yeah.
And so I think that can be tricky. And I suppose, you know, TV shows like what was the Ground Force, you know, where they would go in and blitz the garden in 40 hours.
Yeah.
And that sort of, you know, that was there was quite, I think that was sort of 90s, noughties, wasn't it? That kind of thing. And I remember at that time there was a real trend for people starting to treat their gardens more as an extension of the house. And in many ways that was a really positive thing, because it was meaning that people were spending more time outside. But there was a huge trend for hard landscaping at that time. And all the gardens in Chelsea and things were sort of, you know, 90% concrete and 10% decking. And so there does seem to have been a shift, doesn't there, towards a softer, more natural aesthetic. And I wonder whether, well, I hope that is influenced by people's increased awareness. As you said, you know, there was that boost in awareness. There were campaigns, there were mainstream discussions about the drop in biodiversity. So do you think that's something that could last? You know, are we going to move on from decking?
Oh yeah, good question. I think it comes down to maybe practicalities. So because if you go industry wide, it gets quite difficult, doesn't it? What can we do as individuals when an industry won't move? So if an industry moves away from taking natural stone out of quarries in India, you know, from using different types of mortars other than cement, then the builders that are going to landscapers that are going to make it are going to have the tools and the means to use different materials at the moment, and it will always come down to a price, a cost-effective price. If you're just individually looking at your space, I think you can do much more than just taking the obvious routes. Like we all have to work off costs, but I think what is really important is to just understand the effect, like, so if you know the provenance of your materials, and it's not always given to us with the greatest ease, is it? It can really make a difference. It can make you go, well, hang on a minute. It can make you pause and go, wow, I did not know that is where that came from. So the design side, has changed into a more naturalistic aesthetic, more, I'd say, in the planting. So Pete Rudolph, Nigel Dunnett, that sort of naturalism is a sort of echo of Wildflower Meadow. So it's trying to be lots of grasses, lots of flowers, which is fantastic. But the actual hard landscaping is still using sort of probably really tropical hardwoods and stuff, and mono species forests that we want to really get away from, isn't it? It's really trying to say, okay, if I get that off the peg timber, and then I go down and I walk through Dartmoor and I tut that there's all these horribly barren, managed forests of pine, you can't really do that anymore. You have to, if you want to see a beautiful coppice, hazel and bluebell and beech in oak forests, then you need to start choosing those materials. You need to start choosing sort of, to have coppice ash, and choosing to use hazel in your garden constructions. I think it's a long road. And once you get out into wider industries, I always say that, like, we as people, we're like skiffs. If the wind changes, we can move, but they're like tankers. They can't move that quickly. But with I'm sure you'd agree, and I'm sure lots of people watching this would agree, if you can keep going, if you can keep sort of standing on the soapbox and forcing for change, and forcing for acts and parliament and changes and laws, then you'll get there in the end, I think.
I think that was one of the things that I liked most about your book. I thought that the principles were really helpful for people, because there is some really key principles about ecology and natural systems that we can very easily learn and understand and apply to the spaces that we manage. But I really liked the way that you emphasise the importance of gardeners and gardens, because actually, yes, a huge proportion of our landscape is farmed, and actually farmed also in that very sort of, you could call it very neat and tidy way, because we've got ever increasing fields, no scrub, no messy edges, everything's farmed right up to the hedge, which is very neatly cut. So we're seeing that reflected in the landscape and in the gardens. But the gardens do represent a huge area, and those, there's really, really important nature corridors within the city. And I think sometimes people maybe underestimate the importance of that, and the Ecology of Urban Habitat was a brilliant book in the 70s, written by ecologist Oliver Gilbert, about how important they were. And that was largely not only to do with the fact that they obviously span throughout the urban environment, but also because they are so much more diverse than our rural landscapes. Because our farming landscapes are so non-diverse. People's gardens, if you want a garden which has seasonal interest, and so you want stuff happening throughout the whole year, then what you're doing is you're creating nectar flows, by having your bedding plants and your shrubs and maybe the odd tree, you're creating structural diversity. And it's so just in a way, by trying to make your gardens beautiful, we are putting that diversity in. But I think, the more consciously we can do that, and the more we can understand how to do that well, the better.
I mean, I totally agree. I think farmers are gardening the land a little bit. They are. Their hedges are, cut perfectly. There is almost that pride thing. I think they might be using a flail, which isn't the neatest thing, but they cut them dead straight. And there's this, there's a certain pride in a field that is completely eradicated anything, denuded completely. So I think there is a corollary there, 100%. And gardens have become sanctuaries for wildlife. There's no doubt about that now. I think they even say, or there was a recent report saying that there's more tree cover in our urban areas now than in the countryside. So yes, that might be within parks and street sides, but it also means gardens. So you could understand that. You can when I live out in Somerset, and you can see how scraped it is of trees, and how much sort of diversity there are in the small spaces and gardens. So yeah, 100%. There's no doubt that it's important. And I think, yeah, having people understand, you again, you cannot go out and say, oh, how dare that farmer do that? And then in your own small, tiny space of natural space, do similar things, like, weed out every single wandering wildflower. And, if you want the farmer to allow a looseness and wilder hedgerows, you got to help them change their mind by changing yourself. And I think that's one of my main threads within writing the book was just trying to go back, even though a lot of what was going on at the time was about saying the individual is almost pointless now. We need to go bigger. We need sort of governments. We need America, China, everyone on board. We need big industries changing, laws changing. We certainly do, but I didn't want to lose the sense that you can still sort of do something with your own hands, not just for this moment, but for the fact that it passes down. So if you don't learn how to do things, say, differently, or if you're starting gardening today, just how you do it is then going to pass on down to your children, or your friends or your family. So that's so important to not forget that, and to try these things. And definitely wanted to sort of people to be able to approach this kind of method with nothing, no experience, anything, because gardening is 100% for anyone and everyone. It's just about having a go. It's definitely getting out there and having a go. And sort of, if you can either change and move into an ecological method, or start from there from the very beginning, then it will mean that I think the traditions will change. And that would be really, really important.
And they can change, can't they, very quickly? And I think, our gardens have always been important to us on a well-being level, on a spiritual level. They're our sanctuaries, aren't they? And for a lot of people, gardening is their sort of it's quite a therapeutic process for people. So I think if as gardeners we can engage with our gardens in the way that I think people always have done, but to do it in a way that we can feel that we're making some kind of positive difference. I mean, the pleasure that we get simply from putting a bird feeder up and starting to see more birds come into our garden is immeasurable. And
Yeah.
so we can increase, if we can make our gardens wonderful, abundant wildlife havens, then I think that's going to be so good for us on so many levels, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point, actually. One of the issues I feel that people have with introducing biodiversity into the garden is that they're okay, usually, being quite generalized here, but usually with what they can visually see. So it might be a butterfly, or it might be a bee, or some birds. But a lot of wildlife is going on nocturnal. I do quite like that these people put up these cameras now and they go, I've got a hedgehog. I mean, that's just to see how excited they are. It's fantastic. And but it can also be right down to the tiniest stuff that you're never going to see. You're hardly ever going to see the small insects, the larvae of moths and butterflies, and the tiny sort of ground, dwellings, sort of centipedes, millipedes. You might, and I definitely catch that. But it's understanding that all of these tiny sort of parts of wildlife are part of the whole matrix. They're part of the whole kind of web of wildlife that you need to look after. And And that's when the tough things like saying, hey, how about leaving a patch of nettles is where it comes in, because to many people it's a visual thing, and they don't really maybe quite get it. But if you realize how much wildlife depends on just that one species, you're doing so much, even though you might never see it. So
Mm.
it's jumping those hurdles that I think might be the hardest. And people like Dave Goulson and stuff are really good at sort of bringing that out to show you that, because it's easier for an entomologist to show sort of on screen. And I saw him on Gardener's World. He was, swathing through his long grass with a sort of butterfly catcher, and then picking up all of the bugs that were in there, and it was an extraordinary amount. So just by growing your grass long, you wouldn't believe how much you will increase the amount of biodiverse life in your garden.
Absolutely, yeah, and that sort of that does touch on a potentially divisive topic, the topic of weeds and pests. But I'm not going to launch into that, because I want to make sure we've got time to look at some questions from people watching, and there
Sure.
are a few here, and I wonder whether weeds and pests will come up. But okay, so Jem Fryer says, do you have any suggestions for steep gardens that probably need terracing? We're just buying a house near Totnes with a blank but very steep garden behind our house, and are wondering what things might be most important when designing the garden and the water flow. That's quite an in-depth and specific question. I don't know if you've got
Yeah.
sort of bullet points.
Good. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, well, yeah, I mean, and so it's difficult, isn't it? Because I like to sort of think that you'd approach a soft touch to land. But if it's steep and it's just, it's impossible to keep any of the natural undulations, then terracing is certainly an option. The one bonus that you'll have if you do terrace is that you have a greater ability to harvest rainfall through swales and such like that, or even you could run it through swales out to ponds and gills and rills, sorry, and gullies and things like that. So you certainly have a great ability to be able to harvest rainwater from doing terracing. But you do have to be careful, so just being quite soft touch, because terracing can be quite harsh. It can completely change the natural flow of the land, and you're going to be using quite a lot of hard landscaping to make it happen. Like, you don't have to, so that's what I'm saying, is try and approach it with a different mindset. So if you're going to build a wall, try and do a much more natural method of footings. So when you dig out the footings, put back in rubble stone. You don't need to put in concrete, I don't believe. And then you can start to try and build the wall. If you're holding great masses of soil, it's going to be very difficult to do a dry stack wall, but you could possibly do timbers and then dry stack in front. I think a lot of landscaping needs to be approached as, can I take all of this away and then be hardly anything seen that I was there? Like, I mean, you may pass on your garden to someone at some point, or you may just, need to come to the end of your life, and you know that your garden is being going on for its extended life, and is that going to be a natural space as time goes on? Because I have certainly seen from being a landscaper, some of the amount that goes in is too much. It's too much concrete, too much hard landscaping that is then ripped back out. It overdoes it. It's a building approach instead of a soft approach. So yeah, I mean, have fun. Terracing can be great. You can, really sort of get in there. Great little project. Do some water harvesting, but also try and allow some of the natural elements that are already there.
Brilliant. Okay, I've got another one here from Arthur Pace. He says, your comments on restoring ecosystemic functions in a garden are very interesting. However, people in the neighbourhood might not share the same vision on what a garden should look like. Did you have to deal with any negative attitudes towards the way you garden? And if so, how did you address these issues? So here's the cultural thread again.
Yeah, interesting question. Well, yeah, as I think I touched on by using the word traditional, there is certain sort of I'm going to say entrenched, but it sounds a bit harsh because it's not like that. They're all people are really keen on their gardens, and they've just learned a different way. So, I mean, you must have all had it. Maybe it's down at the let's take it to the allotment. Say, there's always a discussion on the leaning on the spade, isn't it? Oh, do you know dig? Or do you dig? Or, and the same can happen with gardens. If people start to believe in a style and have done their style for a long time, that is very formal, let's say, is probably the complete opposite to what a ecological garden would look like, then yeah, people do always want to question, argue, but I don't think like anything can come from that that's bad. It's just a discussion, isn't it? And it isn't, and I always think, as I say, gardens for everyone, and you could even take that out to the wider climate crisis that we face. Conversations always need to be allowed to be open, and discussion is the most important thing. Don't want to go off into a little corner or an island with this. It would be nice to talk over the fence with someone who's gardened for a long time. Sometimes they will never change, and we're always just different people. If they've got paving in the entirety of their garden and hanging baskets full of tropical bedding, maybe it's best to just sort of go your different ways. But there's gardens are so varied, and British people, again, to be a bit generalized, can sometimes be a little bit stuck in their ways. So you're going to come up against that, and I certainly have.
So I think maybe it's just a communication thing again, as you say, isn't it? And explaining why you're doing it that way, and because I think another generalization you could make about the British people is that they do love nature and wildlife. So there's always that. I feel there's always that to tap into.
100%. Yeah. I truly believe that.
So we've got a few sort of quite practical ones, but we're running a bit low on time. So maybe we could do a kind of, you up for a bit of a quick fire?
Right, hit me. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so Tessa Holmes, the green plastic compost bins.
Right.
Are they okay, or is a compost pile better?
Yeah, you don't need any plastic in your garden. It is the one that I realized because they sell them, and it's the same with the rainwater harvesters, the plastic butt. I do have a little rule that I think if everything that you put in the garden, I think should have sort of aesthetical value, like to you, and that doesn't, as we've gone over many times, mean that things are order, but it can be aesthetically wild. But I think putting plastic, it's just suddenly just something that I personally don't want to look at, and you just really don't need to do it. For one, it's a certain composting method that is not what I advocate. You want to be interacting with your compost pile. You want to be thinking about a compost pile almost like a chef. You need to be cooking it. You need to be, totally involved in it. You can't just sort of get away with leaving it in the corner and forgetting about it. So I think, even though if you have a very, say, she might only have a balcony, if you have a small amount of space, then you can make contained compost piles, and you won't be able to turn it as well as you would do if you were able to have bays or open systems like I write about in the book. So, but really, in general, in life, less plastic is going to be the way forward. I know it's cheaper, but just try your best to sort of say no plastic, and you'll do fine.
Okay, and Tim Elliott says, now this is an interesting one. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. Tim Elliott's moved into a new house and inherited a lawn with plastic meshing underneath it. This feels bad, but a lot of work to remove. Have you got any thoughts? So I wonder whether that's somebody's put down astroturf lawn and then sort of not maintained it.
Yeah, no, it's an evil material. I'm not just, it's an evil product. I've obviously seen a lot of it because it was used extensively with this idea that it's going to repress weeds. It does nothing of the sort. Weeds are they come from seed. more generally than not, almost every biennial and annual that will come into your garden will. So if you put a plastic sheet at the bottom of something and then expect that to be it, it's just not, it's not going to happen. So yeah, I mean, I think I would do anything to get rid of all of the plastic from any garden that you have. So I would certainly be accepting the fact that you know, it's not going to rot away, so you need to get rid of it, or it would take 500 years. So I would have, even though it's quite sort of hard on the space that you have, and I certainly advocate sort of no digging as much as possible, I think I would get in there and get rid of it, yeah, and start again.
It really worries me that I was so astounded when I first heard that this was a thing, and that you know, product and people were using it in gardens. And I do worry also about microplastics and the impact on
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
fauna. Okay, Jeanette Hornby says, how would you go about converting a traditional lawn to a wildflower meadow? And this is an interesting one, sort of leading on, you know, continuing the lawn discussion, because there's this idea, isn't there, that you have to lose all of your fertile topsoil to establish a wildflower meadow.
Yeah, not necessarily true, but that's it's not an easy question to answer, but there's simple ways of going about it. The first thing to understand is that a wildflower meadow is a agricultural process. So it's not, there are natural wildflowers meadows, but they're in sort of extreme environments, like above tree lines in the mountains or right by the sea. So you have to be involved. That's what I'm saying. So it's a process in which it came about through haymaking and using sort of pasture during the winter. But if you have a lawn, you have a quite sort of fertile soil, quite sort of rich, and you have a prevalence of grass seed and grass species. So you need to sort of somehow bring yourself away from both those things. It is, I'm not sure about, you know, ripping out the lawns to get there. I've achieved it without that, but it just takes a lot of involvement. So the first thing you can do is in the autumn, attack it like a mad wolf. So, you know, I use in large places scarifiers, and, you know, even further out to meadows that they make out in fields, they use harrow. If you want to get it, you can get a hand harrow. If you've got a small lawn, you need to rip it way more than you believe. Like you need to get it back to almost looking like 80% there's all, and 20% left of your lawn. Absolutely, just go for it. And then overseed with wildflower pure mix. So don't have grass in the mix. It needs to be a pure mix, much more expensive, unfortunately, but a pure perennial, not annual, perennial wildflower mix. Get that in. And the most important above all is you must seed, weirdly an annual, but I can't really get into that, is the haymaker yellow rattle. So that will parasite on the grass. So if you go to ancient meadows now, they'll all have yellow rattle in them. Even though it's an annual, it finds a way of reseeding itself and parasiting on the grass. So with all of those things in autumn, 100% time to do it for perennial, you will then be on the road. But I can't guarantee it, because for the next 3 to 5 years you need to be really quite active, because you need to sort of be watching what's coming up, whether it didn't. You're going to have to sort of you know, edit is a way of saying it. So if you start to have dandelions and thistles, I don't necessarily think that's a completely wrong thing, but that's not what you seeded. So you're just trying to edit around and try and mitigate into that. And so it's a labor of love. Don't get me wrong, definitely. But if you do have a chance to rip out, then yeah, certain people have advocated that, and it's certainly true. If you, some of the best meadows are on really impoverished chalk soils and things like that. So if you can have the chance to almost take out the entire topsoil down to the subsoil, then yeah, you will probably get a fantastic meadow. But it's quite invasive, isn't it, to do it that way?
It is, and in these days of you know, topsoil being such a sort of
Yeah.
Important resource. It's a difficult thing. But I mean, you can get also maybe not strictly what you would think of as wildflower species mixes. You can get sort of flower mixes, which will increase the diversity. And it's worth, I think, also doing some soil testing and trying to get a seed mix which matches your soil type as well, which I think can really help improve chances.
Yeah, that's a very good point. If you know your underlying soil conditions, so if you know it's chalk, or if you know it's limestone, or you know it's going to be boggy and wet, yeah, then specific to that is really going to help you hugely. No
Okay.
argument.
Well, thanks, Matt. We've really made use of, of your presence, and we've come right up to, it's just gone 7 o'clock, so we'll wrap up. But thank you so much. That was really interesting, and thanks for being so willing to answer people's garden questions as well.
Oh no, thank you, Caroline. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and good luck with the book. I hope it all goes well. So that's The Ecological Gardener by Matt Rees-Warren, and it's
Out Thursday.
out on Thursday.
Yeah.
All good bookshops, I'm sure.
Open bookshops, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you also to everybody who attended and tuned in to listen. So tonight's talk was a free event, but we are grateful for any donations, and the recommended donation is £5, which would be split equally between Schumacher College and the authors. There will be a link put into the chat panel for making that donation. So look out also for, we're doing some live chat events. If you're interested in the BSc Regenerative Food and Farming Programme or any of the other programmes at Schumacher College, check out the website and you'll see that we have live chat online sessions where you can come and ask your questions and learn more about each of those programmes. Thank you again to Chelsea Green for co-hosting this event. And the next talk in the series next month will be with Nancy and John Hayden, talking about their book Farming on the Wild Side and about their particular approach to regenerative farming. So I hope you've enjoyed the session and hopefully see you next time. Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.